Welcome to the Paul Christopher Show. This is Paul Christopher. There's a struggle in the world today, a conflict older than history. It's a competition of ideas and their proponents. It's about who is right and who is wrong and how major decisions are being made. But is it really? And how can we change this dynamic? The Iran Contra Affair. On November 3rd, 1986, Lebanese newspaper Shiraa reported that the United States secretly sold arms to Iran. The Iran Contra Affair broke into the news cycle during the dawn of CNN and 24 hours a day news coverage. The story brought to light the illegal sales of arms to Iran by the CIA and the use of the proceeds to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Both actions were unlawful and prohibited by Congress. An Iranian arms embargo was in place through executive orders of both Presidents Carter and Reagan.
Before we jump right into the story, let's take in a listen to the second debate between Ronald Reagan and former Vice President Walter Mondale that took place on October 21st, 1984, to understand a little bit of Ronald Reagan's ability to join people together, including his political opponents, through humor.
Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
President Reagan knew that people cannot be angry at you and laughing with you at the same time. And this is something that's really been lost in today's politics, where we see most factions fighting, yelling, shouting, and being angry at each other. It'd be great to see someone use this ability to bring people together. That's really been lost. But let's get back into the story and jump right back into Iran Contra.
The Iran Contra scandal held America's attention and rocked support of President Reagan. According to Gallup, Reagan's job approval rating dropped from 63% in late October 1986, which was right before the scandal broke, to a low of 47% by December 1986. Although Reagan's approval rating remained low through all of 1987, America's perceptions of Reagan improved steadily after he left office. In 2002, 73% of Americans approved of the way Ronald Reagan had managed his presidency. Although it was never proven that Reagan had knowledge of the illegal aspects of the scheme, President Reagan famously used the "I don't recall" defense under testimony.
And ask if that further refreshes your recollection.
No, I know this man, of course, very well. Met with him a number of times in his own country. I don't recall.
It defies all but the most Byzantine logic that these actions could have taken place without the president's direct knowledge and approval. If, however, we are left to believe that the National Security Council undertook and approved of the arms sales and support of the Contras outside of explicit presidential assent, then even more serious concerns are raised about controls in place to prevent illegal and unauthorized actions by rogue NSC members and the CIA. The events of the Iran Contra Affair are bookended by the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979 through to November 1986, when the story broke. These events transpired during the terms of 2 presidents, Carter and Reagan. There are 4 revelations that immediately jump out as the most egregious transgressions. The first, the Reagan administration violated its own executive order barring the sale of weapons to Iran. They did this in order to free U.S. hostages and to provide support of the Contras. Reagan also did not live up to his own ideals or promises to the American people when he famously quipped in 1985, "The United States gives terrorists no rewards. We make no concessions. We make no deals." The second, the secret and illegal mining of Nicaraguan harbors by the CIA, which was in violation of international law. How dare the CIA, outside of congressional approval, mine the ports of an independent state? The third revelation, allegations that the CIA was involved in cocaine trafficking as a source of revenue for the Contras in Nicaragua. This became the subject of congressional investigations, and the allegations were never proven. These alleged events took place during the time of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, aimed at reducing drug use in the United States, and President Reagan's renewed war on drugs agenda. The fourth revelation, among the most egregious, was conspiracy to violate tax laws. As lawful taxpayers, we all find this very offensive. Illicitly gained monies from sales of arms to Iran were transferred to Swiss bank accounts under fictitious company names to hide the sales from the IRS. As always on the Paul Christopher Show, let's start out with the basics. Who are the Sandinistas? The Sandinista National Liberation Front, or known as the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional in Spanish, the Sandinistas were Cuban and Soviet-backed Marxists active in Nicaragua that took power in January 1979. Named after Augusto Cesar Sandino, a revolutionary who led the fight against American occupation of Nicaragua during the 1930s, the Sandinistas took away private property and businesses. They nationalized the banks, mines, and transit. They abolished the court system and constitution and replaced them by civil defense committees, which were staffed by peasants and workers. Who were the Contras? The Contras were various U.S. and Saudi-backed groups fighting in opposition to the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Made up of farmers, peasants, and ex-military, the main Contras group was the Nicaraguan Defense Force, or FDN. How were the Iranians involved? For a refresher, the Iranian Revolution began in January 1979, when Muslim clerics led by the Ayatollah Khomeini swept to power and ousted the U.S.-backed Shah of Iran, Shah Pahlavi. The Shah ruled as an absolute monarch. The U.S. had a long-term strategic interest in Iran, as it's the site of many oil-rich lands. On November 5, 1979, students at the University of Tehran became swept up by clerics in anti-West anger and set about burning and razing all symbols of the West. Unfortunately for the U.S., President Jimmy Carter continued his support of the Shah even after the Shah abandoned his country under the pretense of requiring medical care. Why were sales of arms to Iran illegal? The sale of arms to Iran were illegal due to an arms embargo that was first put in place by President Jimmy Carter and later during the Reagan administration. President Carter used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to empower the executive order. That act is a United States federal law authorizing the president to regulate international commerce after declaring a national emergency, which is done in response to any unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. First enacted on November 14, 1979, and renewed most recently in March 2021 by President Joe Biden Jr., it's the longest and oldest existing state of emergency. After Reagan, more crushing sanctions were signed by President Bill Clinton, also via executive orders. So why was support of the Contras illegal? Well, Congress passed the Boland Amendment in multiple versions to explicitly prevent the use of funds or resources to overthrow the government of Nicaragua or to start a war between Nicaragua and Honduras. For some background, U.S. President Jimmy Carter sent the Sandinistas $99 million in aid in 1979 in the hope of making the Sandinista government more pro-U.S. By early 1980, Carter's attempts to curry favor with the Sandinistas had failed. Instead of continuing to build an alliance with the Sandinistas, President Carter authorized CIA support of forces in Nicaragua opposed to the Sandinistas through propaganda and by providing assistance, but not armed action. In March 1980, violence in opposition to the Sandinistas broke out in Nicaragua, led by the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, or FDN, Fuerza Democrática Nicaragüense, the main Contras group. When Ronald Reagan becomes president in 1981, he quickly ends support to the Sandinistas and begins a covert policy of supporting opposition groups. The public policy of the U.S. at the time is to interdict or prevent arms trafficking in the region. However, Reagan signs approval for the CIA to provide arms, equipment, and money to the Contras by the end of 1981 and in early 1982. All of this is hidden from the U.S. public. In June 1982, as the Sandinistas continues to support revolutionaries in nearby El Salvador, President Reagan makes the policy of supporting opposition groups to socialist revolutions public. Known as the Reagan Doctrine, the policy was designed to stop the spread of Soviet influence globally by supporting and arming guerrilla fighters opposed to Soviet-Cuban-style Marxism without the use of U.S. military. Key groups supported by the Reagan Doctrine were the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Unidas in Angola, the Contras in Nicaragua, and the Khmer People's National Liberation Front in Cambodia, which was a group opposed to the Khmer Rouge. Although widely viewed as successful in stopping Soviet aggression, the Reagan Doctrine supported and continued war in foreign countries where the U.S. may not have held long-term national security interests. It's against our key belief here at the Paul Christopher Show to break the laws made by Congress, or any laws for that matter, or to support groups which have violated the human rights of individuals. It's immoral and wrong. Since this podcast is focused on the reduction of human suffering and misery, in general, we would be opposed to support of such groups through arms, equipment, money, or training. What is the National Security Council, and who are the key people on it at the time of Iran Contra? The National Security Council was established in 1947 to advise the president on domestic, international, and military security issues. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan headed up the NSC, with his Vice President George H.W. Bush, Secretary of State George Shultz, and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. The Director of the CIA, William Casey, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, William Crowe, were advisors to the NSC at the time. Vice Admiral John Poindexter served in multiple capacities, including Deputy National Security Advisor to the President. What was the Iran Contra Affair? The Iran Contra Affair was a scheme by which the NSC and CIA illegally sold weapons to Iran and then used the proceeds to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Both actions were illegal and violated acts of Congress and the trust of the American people. To get our heads around Iran Contra, let's talk about Iran first. Iran was in need of weapons during its war with Iraq in the period between 1980 and 1988. Iraq wanted to prevent a similar Shia Islamic revolution in Iraq. Shia Muslims are the majority in Iraq, with the ruling, at the time, Sunni Ba'ath Party members being in the minority. Iraq also had visions of being the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. actively sought to prevent U.S.-made weapons from getting into the hands of the Iranians during this period, a program known as Operation Staunch. In July 1983, moderate groups in Iran indicated to Robert McFarlane, who was an advisor to the NSC, that they would be amenable to better relations with America if supplied with arms. The message was communicated via a Saudi Arabian man named Adnan Khashoggi. Robert McFarlane and a CIA officer met with a number of Iranians, including arms dealer Manakhur Ghorbanifar. As a major oil producer, good relations with Iran was a strategic U.S. interest. 53 hostages who were taken by university students in November 1979 were released on President Reagan's Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1981. However, a group named the Islamic Jihad took more U.S. hostages beginning in March 1984. It was Iran's interest in gaining weapons and the U.S.'s desire to gain better relations with the